What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Thank you for clicking onto this reaction. I hope you're looking forward to it just as much as I am. If you haven't already, head over to the content creators page. That link is in the description box down below. If you haven't already and you're enjoying our content, you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but we're going to jump straight into this one. So Japanese Militarism, Blood on the Railway, Episode 3. Let's go.
Manchuria, June 4th, 1928, 5:20 a.m. A train speeds through the darkness in the last few minutes before the dawn. Inside sits Chinese warlord Zhang Zolin, a former bandit. He is master of Manchuria, and until last month, the dictator of the Republic of China. But he's running now, ousted when the nationalist generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, and his northern expansion forced him out of the capital. Humbled, he returns to the territory he squeezed to financial collapse, intent on fulfilling his dream of holding Beijing. For the first time in months, Chiang is safe. His men guard this railway, apart from the portion where it crosses the Southern Manchurian Railroad, controlled by his ally Japan, and he can see the crossing bridge quickly approaching. Soon he'll be in his capital and plotting his comeback. An explosion on the tracks rips the train car nearly in half. Two of Chiang's generals die in front of him, and he himself is mortally wounded. The grisly work of
This is the bridge that the Japanese blew up to sort of instigate the Sino-Japanese War, right? Or have I just made a complete twat of myself on the internet once again?
a bomb planted by his allies in the Japanese army. Now, you might have noticed for a series on Japanese militarism, so far we've mostly talked about civilian politics, and there's a good reason for that. Because to understand how the tail started to wag the dog in Japanese government, we first have to really understand the dog. And while we spent last episode talking about political parties and factionalism, today we're going to be talking about more factionalism. Because every organization we discuss in this series, the military included, was just a Russian doll of factions.
The thing with it is I think a lot of governments are just like that, factions within factions within factions. And that's what causes so many problems within these sort of situations.
For example, the Japanese Army and Navy had fundamentally different versions of territorial expansion. The Navy wanted to expand south into China and Southeast Asia as a way to counter a possible naval war with the United States, while the Army, by contrast, thought the key was to dominate Manchuria, which would give it a buffer against both the Soviet Union and the increasingly unified China, and allow Japan to directly extract natural resources it otherwise had to gain through foreign trade.
Once again, it was suffering the same problem as Germany, where it just didn't have any natural resources, so it had to go gain those from outside places.
But even within the army, there were also factions. For instance, a radical group known as the Imperial Way faction, mostly made up of junior officers like lieutenants, captains, and colonels from the countryside, preached an abolishment of civilian government and a restoration of the emperor as the sole political power.
Yeah, they just wanted basically, no civilian government rule, which is very interesting, and a militarized state.
They wanted Japan to go back to the period of its glory, with a revered emperor and loyal samurai, and without the corruptions of party politics, big corporations, industrialization, and commercialism. Now, if you've seen our other series on the Sengoku,
which, once again, with a culture sort of so heavily invested into culture and the essence of what they were, you understand why they want to sort of hold some of those true to their heart and bring them back. Japanese Army and Navy could never agree on anything ever. Yeah, I know. I've sort of looked into these warfare of World War II, and yeah, they just couldn't agree on anything. And it's one of the main sort of problems they had was the infighting within the Japanese Army caused so many issues for them.
Could you die? And the end of the samurai, you realize this period never really existed. They were hearkening back to an imaginary past. Their rivals were the Control faction, who wanted to work within the current system, but like the Imperial Way, also saw military expansion into Manchuria and China as the solution to Japan's economic, political, trade, and population difficulties. But they also believed in more modernization and industry than the Imperial Way did, and largely strived to get Japan in a position to preemptively strike and defeat the Soviet Union. But both of these factions
once again, they were scared of the communists, weren't they?
Tested civilian government, which they saw as westernized, corrupt, and beholden to the Zaibatsu.
The emperor had no power over the military, the Japanese military. But yeah, I definitely think he did sort of want to go the direction that they were going in, but I don't know how far he wanted to go.
Civilian government, which they saw as westernized, corrupt,
Hmm.
and beholden to the Zaibatsu, the large corporations that backed parties and candidates. However, it should be noted that the control faction also believed the Zaibatsu were a key ingredient in Japan's war machine. Of these
Ah,
groups, a small sub-faction believed that if they could force an international crisis and get the military into combat, then they could take the reins away from the civilian leaders.
and this is where this sort of attack on the train line sort of comes from, right?
This, they believed, would serve both country and emperor. And most of those plots centered on an area that was then called Manchuria, a term we're going to use for clarity's sake, but just know that name has some baggage attached to it that we'll definitely discuss in our Lies episode. Anyway, in 1905,
okay.
one of the spoils Japan had acquired during the Russo-Japanese War was the South Manchuria Railway, cutting through northeastern China. Control of this railway had given Japan access to the many raw materials it needed to import from China and Mongolia, and the corridor around the rails had been developed heavily by the Zaibatsu, with factories and towns for Japanese workers.
Okay.
Plus, a large Japanese force, the Kwantung Army, guarded these interests against Chinese warlords and local bandits. But the militarist factions wanted more. They wanted all of Manchuria, which is where Chang Zolin comes in. See, the Kwantung Army wanted to split governance of Manchuria with him, but he seemed poised to either open Manchuria to trade with the US and Britain, or else lose control to the Russian-backed Shang, who might set up a Soviet puppet state. So,
And again, when you're caught into a rock and a hard place, you are going to be worried about both of those sort of situations. The Emperor didn't necessarily want to oppose them, but I definitely don't think that he had the power that he thought he had over them. You know what I mean? Like, I think he wanted to go ahead with what they were doing, but I don't think necessarily he agreed with how far they were going at times. He didn't have the control of his dogs of war, but he did want to let him off the leash, but he weren't able to get him released. That's what I think.
a group of junior officers decided to assassinate him and either install a more competent warlord or provoke a full Japanese invasion and take direct control. But the plot backfired. They never told their senior officers about it, and the Kwantung Army simply wasn't ready to invade. Plus, when it leaked that the Japanese army officers had planted the bomb, the civilian government was furious, and Japan's image tarnished on the world stage. Then Shang's son came to power, and in retaliation, handed Manchuria to Shang. The military, for their part, stonewalled the Prime Minister's investigation into the explosion. And when the Prime Minister reported this to Emperor Hirohito, a few careless, displeased words from the monarch meant it was the Prime Minister who ended up resigning.
He kind of wanted to happen.
The Kwantung Army had, essentially, proved it could act unilaterally and without approval or oversight of the civilian government, and suffer zero consequences. And to Hirohito, who had not actually wanted the Prime Minister to resign, it was a sign that he shouldn't insert himself into politics.
Okay, interesting.
Meanwhile, the economy took a dive. Japan had barely clawed its way out of financial panic when the Great Depression laid it low. The country survived on agricultural and textile exports, particularly silks, and now prices for those goods fell dramatically. So to keep in business, factories tried to make up for this by producing more, leading to an oversupply problem, all while families starved in the countryside. The Liberal Party in power, the Minseto, took deep political damage as well. A successor of the Kensekai, their financial policies only worsened the situation. This in turn radicalized large segments of the population who, primed by school curriculums and military service, bought into arguments that civilian government had failed and been corrupted by the Zaibatsu.
Once again, they were just sort of trying to push their political views on the youth to sort of make a change. Very interesting, because he's very similar to what other countries have done in the past as well.
Military, voters increasingly thought, was Japan's last pure institution. The Minseto became a further target of rage due to its foreign policy. They backed diplomatic engagement with the United States, which had just banned all Asian immigrants angering the Japanese public, along with non-engagement in China.
Wait, what was that?
Foreign policy. They backed last pure institution. The Minseto became a further target of rage due to its foreign policy. They backed diplomatic engagement with the United States, which had just banned all Asian immigrants angering the Japanese public.
Well, the United States just banned all Asian immigrants.
Along with non-engagement in China. They also cut military budgets. But the last straw was the signing of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which the Navy claimed undermined Japan's maritime defense and usurped the Emperor's power as commander-in-chief.
So that's probably one of the biggest no-goes, I think, in that situation. That's really putting them into a position where they feel like they're going to have to take action. Because I definitely feel like I would if I was in that sort of situation.
Calls for radical action proliferated, which was increasingly dangerous, as Japan had a long history of authorities excusing political violence if it was spontaneous and the attacker's motives were considered sincere. And as we saw with Chang's assassination, those in power were hesitant to punish bad actors if they claimed patriotic motives or said they acted to protect the emperor and further the national interest. In November,
because they were doing it, doing it for the emperor, and we've sort of had that sort of covered on previous sort of videos as well.
November of 1930, an ultranationalist belonging to an anti-communist group shot and wounded the Minseto prime minister at Tokyo Station, not far from where Hara had been killed.
I remember hearing about that as well.
The conservative Sayukai Party then used the wounded prime minister's inability to come into the Diet as pretext for claiming he couldn't govern. The prime minister died the next year. Then in March of 1931, a group of junior officers called the Cherry Blossom Society, so named because they said the life of a soldier was fleeting like a cherry blossom, tried to spark riots that would instigate martial law.
That's a really interesting metaphor.
Paving the way for a coup, but said riots were badly organized and failed. To avoid repercussions,
of course their treaty was ineffective. Like I said, you've just forced them to react, so they're going to ignore that treaty, aren't they? And you've now just provoked them. You're just causing more issues than it was really worth.
General, who they'd planned to make prime minister, hushed the incident up, and again, no one was punished. But that was mere prelude to another plot, a rail bombing, just like back in 1928. September 18th, 1931, South Manchuria Railway. Quietly, the lieutenant lays bundles of blasting powder by the train tracks. The plan, devised by a colonel and lieutenant colonel, is this: blow the railway, attract Chinese troops from a nearby barracks, blame the blast on them, and invade in retaliation. He backs off, hears the train coming, and detonates. Unaware, the train speeds toward the damaged area of track, hits it, sways, and continues on, never knowing it passed the epicenter of a new and bloody war.
Oh, so it didn't stop. Like, it was able to just continue onwards. But I'm assuming the Chinese warriors are still going to come and react.
The explosives, it turns out, were too far from the tracks to cause much damage. But that doesn't matter, and the charade goes on. The next day, Japanese artillery fires on the Chinese garrison in retaliation, and 500 soldiers cross into Chinese territory. Suddenly, as planned, Japan is at war, and in Tokyo, the military coup will come within weeks. Okay.
And we will find out what happens in the next episode. Oh, there's a lot of breaks for this video. They don't normally have that many breaks. But yeah, once again, I'm really enjoying my journey through the Japanese history. This is sort of one of my really enjoyed sort of areas.